Taking a dip in the ocean can be an invigorating experience, but this diver took things to the next level. While Shlomi Katzin was swimming off the coast of Israel close to Haifa, he noticed something strange resting on the seabed beneath him. It wasn't entirely obvious what this artifact was, but something told Katzin it was important. He couldn't have known at that moment just how right he was. A diver in Israel spotted a strange shape on the seafloor, and then the reality dawned on him. Ocean currents had disturbed the seabed, meaning objects that had been hiding beneath the sand were now revealed. And there were plenty of them. In addition to this weirdly shaped item that first caught his eye, Katzin noticed a bunch of other things, too. But what were they, and how long had they been there? Katzin realized that he didn't have much time to ponder whatever it was that he was regarding. If he didn't act quickly, then the tide would scatter sand all over these objects again, hiding them from view once more. And if that happened, the chances of him finding them again would be remote, to say the least. He had to do something right away. Determined to bring this strange object up to the surface, Katzin dove down to the seabed. This can't have been easy, given that the thing was 4 feet in length, shaped awkwardly, and was also pretty heavy. Nothing was going to stop Katzin now, though, and he eventually managed to retrieve the mysterious artifact. Katzin felt strongly that he'd recovered something really special, so he alerted archaeologists to his discovery. And when these experts saw what he'd found for themselves, they unequivocally confirmed Katzin's suspicions. This thing really was of great significance. It was a relic of an especially turbulent and consequential time in history. Of course, this was hardly the first time a groundbreaking discovery of this nature had been made in Israel. The country, after all, is littered with sites of tremendous historical importance. Archaeological investigations take place all over the territory, overseen by a governmental body known as the Israel Antiquities Authority, IAA. Modern archaeological excavations started in this part of the world back in the mid-19th century. At that time, researchers tended to concentrate on finding locations referenced in the Bible. The focus of investigation has expanded since that time, though, with experts now looking for evidence relating to all periods in the area's rich history. During the early digs in Israel, tangible artifacts such as pieces of pottery were deemed most important. In more recent times, though, archaeological techniques have become more sophisticated. Today, they've also enabled the study of topics such as the physical condition of the people who lived in a given region or the nature of their social relations. Archaeologists have plenty to get stuck into when it comes to studying the lands of Israel. After all, the place has a long, rich story that goes back to prehistoric times. It also occupies an unusually significant point on Earth, given its location at the nexus of 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. This part of the world once acted as a sort of bridge between different and distinct cultures. And on top of that, it remains a central location within all 3 of the main Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all intrinsically linked to the land, and each one has helped shape its history. The many archaeological sites dotted across Israel all evidence the rich and fascinating history that defines the region. These places have produced some incredible artifacts over the years, perhaps most notably the Dead Sea Scrolls. These manuscripts represent the oldest copies of the Bible that have ever been discovered. So many different cultures left their mark on Israel, including the mighty Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire which succeeded it. People from these civilizations raised cities throughout the land, but they weren't the only ones to do so. Islamic civilizations also thrived in Israel at various times, and they can also be glimpsed today in the ruins of ancient cities. Given that so many distinct cultures have laid claim to Israel throughout the centuries, conflict was inevitable. The Crusades, for example, marked a particularly consequential period of turmoil throughout the land. These were wars of religion that took place over hundreds of years, with Christians on one side and Muslims on the other. The Crusades trace back to the late 11th century, a time when civilizations in Western Europe were starting to emerge as major powers. The Byzantine Empire was still around at this point too, but it was beginning to weaken because of pressure from the Islamic Seljuk Empire. That's when an individual named Alexius Comnenus took control in 1081, becoming the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. In the year 1095, Alexius reached out to Pope Urban II, which was no small undertaking. This new rapport between the two leaders represented a unification between Eastern and Western Christianity, the first time such an alliance had been successfully forged. Now, though, the two sides joined together with the mutual aim of conquering land controlled by the Muslims, including Israel. In November 1095, the Pope encouraged Christians across Western Europe to go and help the Byzantines by embarking on a religious quest to the Holy Land. Many civilians responded and teamed up with trained fighters to form a religious army intent on wresting control of the area from the Muslims. A campaign we know today as the First Crusade. What we call the First Crusade got underway in 1096 when Christians from modern-day Germany, Italy, and France set out. Thousands of men made the journey, eventually arriving at the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. With nobles and knights leading the way, these forces then managed to take over various Muslim-controlled cities for themselves. In 1099, the Crusaders attacked the city of Jerusalem in what proved to be a bloody and horrific battle. Thousands of people lost their lives in the violence, with the Christians eventually emerging as the victors. In the most brutal of fashions, the invaders from Europe had conquered the land. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was set up by the Christian victors, which held together for many decades. Meanwhile, the Second Crusade was launched in 1147, aiming to retake land in Mesopotamia, now controlled by the Seljuk Turks. Muslim forces beat back the invaders this time, though, and the conquest had failed by 1149. And by 1187, Muslim forces had managed to recapture Jerusalem, too. All these humiliations sat badly with the Christians back in Europe, so in 1189 the Third Crusade was initiated. This time around, fighters from England were involved, but that didn't exactly help much in the end. The conquest was ultimately another failure, with the city of Jerusalem remaining comfortably under Muslim control. Over the next 2 centuries, more and more crusades were initiated. Never, though, would the Christian forces retake control of the coveted city of Jerusalem. Their Islamic opponents, in the end, proved themselves to be stronger in all aspects. Militarily, politically, scientifically, and culturally. Despite all the blood that was spilled, the attempted conquests of the Islamic world were a failure for the Christians. And to make things worse for them, their aggression also triggered a fearsome response from the Turks. These forces took the major hub of Constantinople in 1453, before forging into Europe itself and conquering areas including modern-day Hungary and parts of Austria. The Crusades were definitely a failure for the Christians in terms of taking over the Muslim world. But despite that, Western Europe still managed to benefit in some ways from these religious wars. Revolutionary concepts in the fields of maths, science, and medicine were imported from Eastern cultures into the West. The Christians returned home to Europe with brand new ideas that would ultimately go on to change the region. And on top of that, they also came back with tangible benefits, including tasty spices and exotic fruits. Their religious wars had been a failure, but European society was still transformed by them. Given all this background, you can imagine how excited historians and archaeologists can get whenever artifacts from the chaotic period of the Crusades are discovered. These wars shaped so many cultures and civilizations, for better and for worse. Anything that can help us to paint a clearer image of what happened is to be treasured. That's why the diver Shlomi Katzin's find was so important. But what was this weird thing he'd spotted on the seabed? It was rough and covered in shells, which had rather distorted its shape a little. But taking a good look at the object, it was pretty clear. It was a sword. What wasn't immediately obvious, though, were the artifact's origins. Experts, though, have a compelling theory about the provenance of this ancient weapon. They think it once belonged to a Crusader, someone from Europe who'd come to Israel to try and claim the land for Christianity. And for fully 900 years since it fell into the water, this weapon rested on the ocean floor, waiting to be found. Were it not for a spot of luck, this sword may never have been discovered. The only reason it was visible to Katzin, after all, was because the seabed had been disturbed by the tide. And thankfully, Katzin himself had the good sense to grab the weapon before it was covered over again. When Katzin informed the IAA of what he'd found in the water, as you might expect, its experts were delighted to learn the news. That's clear to see from a statement put out by one of their leading figures, an inspector by the name of Nur Distelfeld. Distelfeld, part of the IAA's robbery prevention unit, called its discovery beautiful and rare, going on to remark that it evidently belonged to a Crusader knight. He added, "It was found encrusted with marine organisms, but is apparently made of iron. It is exciting to encounter such a personal object, taking you 900 years back in time to a different era." Kobe Sharvat is the head of marine archaeology at the IAA, and he's also expressed his fascination. Speaking to the BBC in October 2021, Sharvat indulged his imagination a little by envisioning the person who had once wielded this sword. In particular, he focused on the strength this individual must have had. Speaking of the sword, Sharvat said, "It's heavy because of the stones that are glued to it, and also because it's an iron sword and very big. That means that the guy that held this sword and fought with it was very strong. He should really be in good fitness. It's amazing." The sword hadn't been the only thing diver Katzin had noticed on the seabed. A series of other shapes could be seen there, too, but what were they? Well, it turned out that many of them were old anchors, which would make sense. This area, after all, is known to have once served as a sort of harbor in ancient times. In a statement, Sharvat remarked, "The Carmel coast contains many natural coves that provided shelter for ancient ships in a storm, and larger coves around which entire settlements and ancient port cities developed, such as Dor and Atlat. These conditions have attracted merchant ships down the ages, leaving behind rich archaeological finds." Archaeologists were already aware the coast flanking the Carmel mountain range was a treasure trove of discoveries waiting to be made. Artifacts had been discovered around there before, the oldest of which suggest this ancient harbor was being used about 4 millennia ago. As such, the Crusader sword and the medieval anchors were the latest items in a long line of historical artifacts to have been uncovered there. Even though archaeologists recognize the importance of this place, though, discoveries can still be difficult to come by. So much depends on how the sand has settled upon the seabed on any given day. Sometimes artifacts will be visible, while at other points they'll be totally hidden. As Sharvat explained in his statement, though, discoveries are increasingly being made by amateur divers. He said, "The discovery of ancient finds by swimmers and leisure divers is a growing phenomenon in recent years, with the increasing popularity of such sports. This, understandably, is a welcome development for the archaeological community." Sharvat went on, "Underwater surveying is dynamic. Even the smallest storm moves the sand and reveals areas on the seabed, meanwhile burying others. It is therefore vitally important to report any such finds, and we always try to document them in situ in order to retrieve as much archaeological data as possible. There's surely plenty more waiting to be discovered along this stretch of coastline, but for now the Crusader sword is enough for experts to pore over. In fact, there are even plans to allow the public to enjoy it. Once it's been cleaned and examined properly, it will be put on show." The head of the IAA is Eli Escocito, and he was delighted that a member of the public had brought the sword to his organization's attention. He said, "Every ancient artifact that is found helps us piece together the historical puzzle of the land of Israel. Once the sword has been cleaned and researched in the Israel Antiquities Authority's laboratories, we will ensure it is displayed to the public." Not too far away, Salma Asaf had a feeling that her house in the Israeli village of Melia was special. It stood right beside an enormous castle, so she wondered if some historic secrets were hiding just below the surface. Salma was spurred into action by an architectural crisis near her house. The neighboring castle was around 9 centuries old, so naturally it was beginning to fall apart. It became clear to all the residents of Melia that something had to be done, or else someone was going to get hurt. Rabbi Kamasi, a local archaeologist, led the village's efforts in dealing with the castle. As he saw it, the residents needed to do something fast to protect the kids in the neighborhood. It wasn't as easy as just closing off the property. He explained to the Haaretz newspaper in 2019, "What child doesn't head straight for a road marked no entrance?" By the start of 2017, things were getting downright dangerous. A wall at the northern end of the castle started to collapse, which meant big segments of stone tumbled down. Rabbi recalled, "I said to my wife, If the fort falls in front of me, I have no right to live here. The archaeologist knew he needed to act before someone got really hurt. The problem, though, was that fixing up this castle wasn't going to be cheap. An estimate for the cost of the project settled at $861,000, and the government refused to help. With that, Rebbe was forced to take matters into his own hands. He painstakingly visited everyone in the village, informing them about the situation and asking for donations. The archaeologist worried all his efforts would be in vain. Luckily for Rebbe, his neighbors seemed to share his passion. He explained, "Melians love archaeology." Divided among the families, it worked out to 66 shekels per person. I asked everybody to donate the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes, and for that I would preserve the fort and safeguard our children and our antiquities. In the end, Rebbe managed to convince people from about 250 homes to contribute. On top of that, he wrung out a relatively small sum from the local government, plus a little extra from businesses in the area. Rebbe had pulled the community together, and the restoration project could now get underway. That larger construction project got Salma thinking. As the entire village came together to fix up the castle, she decided to finance an excavation beneath her own house. It seemed like a real shot in the dark, but Salma had a hunch that she was living on top of something huge. And it's hardly a surprise that Melia was so full of history enthusiasts willing to dish out money for archaeological investigations. The village, after all, had a remarkably rich history that went back a long time. It's only natural, then, that Salma and her neighbors would take a passionate interest. Of course, they knew it wasn't the happiest story in the world. The history of Melia was long and turbulent, but the Byzantine period was particularly explosive. By the year 390 AD, the land of Israel, including Melia, was firmly under Byzantine control. As such, the inhabitants of the village had become Christians, but this wouldn't last. Within a few centuries, Islam would take over as the main religion. Even then, larger power struggles continued to upset ordinary life in the region, often through violence. So, by 1099, the land of Israel was once again under Christian control. This time, though, it was as a result of the Crusades, where invading European armies took over and established the entity known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that turn of events forever changed Salma's hometown. This period of Christian dominance throughout Israel saw the village of Melia thrive. It became an important center of activity, during which authorities built the castle that still stands there today. Rebbe, for his part, thinks this structure may have been the brainchild of King Baldwin III of Jerusalem in the 12th century. King Baldwin III had originally ruled over Israel alongside his mother, a woman named Queen Melisande. This arrangement broke down, however, and the two could no longer bear to work together. They split their kingdom in two, with Melisande ruling over a territory that included Jerusalem and Baldwin taking the Galilee region. Around the year 1160, Baldwin passed on control of the castle in Melia to a knight named John of Haifa. On top of that, John was also given 9 other small communities in the surrounding area. That meant that Melia, in practice, acted as the controlling hub of a wider fief. That made it more important than ever, but also more desired by competing powers. The tide turned once again for Melia in 1187, when the famed Sultan Saladin took control of the region. This period of Islamic rule was fairly short-lived, though, and following the launch of the Third Crusade, the village was back under Christian control again. Those years must have been topsy-turvy for the people living there. The survivors did their best to pick up the pieces. By the year 1226 or so, the people of Galilee erected a citadel called Montfort Castle. The construction of this newer castle seems to have undermined the status of Melia, which started to falter around the same time. The village's glory days were firmly coming to an end. The Islamic Mamluks then reigned over Melia for a spell, but the region soon fell under the control of the Ottomans. At this point around the 15th century, though, something dramatic happened in the area. It appears that Melia collapsed and nobody fully understands exactly why. Speaking to Haaretz, Rebbe said, "We find no mention from that time, nor has any pottery from that period been discovered so far." By the following century, though, the historical record tells us that Melia was no longer the important spot it once was. Only a small number of people continued to inhabit it. While historians aren't sure of exactly what happened to Melia, Rabbi does have a couple of his own ideas. He suggested that some catastrophe afflicted the city, be that a big earthquake or a pandemic. The Black Death, after all, wasn't just confined to Europe around the medieval era. The phase of Melia's history that takes us to the present began around the 1740s, when Greek Catholics moved into the village, where they constructed homes and had families. The modern residents of Melia, including Rabbi, can largely trace their lineages back to these people. As we've seen, Melia experienced plenty of dramatic changes throughout its long, unstable history. It should be no surprise, then, that the people who live in the area today are so interested in preserving and learning about its past. That's ultimately what drove Rabbi to undertake excavations there, though he uncovered more surprises than he bargained for. The castle at Melia was obviously a pressing concern for Rabbi. Its deteriorating state meant it needed to be shored up to keep locals safe, not to mention to preserve a key piece of history. But he soon turned his attention to a much smaller and less notable site in the village. It was Salma Asaf's house. Salma's ancestors had first arrived in Melia up to 250 years ago, meaning she has a deep connection to the place. She was even willing to throw her home into disarray in order to get some answers about the past. She spoke about this in very plain terms, remarking to Haaretz, "I wanted to know what was underneath my home." Using their own money, Salma and her family paid for Rabbi to conduct some excavations beneath their home. This quickly led to amazing results, with the archaeologist finding a wall dating back to the time of the Crusades. This was encouraging, but more works would be necessary and they wouldn't come cheap. Salma had to drum up the money for further excavations herself, but enough cash was eventually raised to carry on. The archaeologists could keep digging, which meant peeling through the layers of the village's varied history. And thankfully, all the work and money proved to be worth it when they found something spectacular. Beneath Salma's house, the archaeologists found some sort of facility that dated back to the Crusades. It was split into two rooms, which were situated over a large stone pit. The space was pretty large, and experts were quickly able to deduce what it had been used for. It was a winery. You might be wondering why that's supposedly such a big deal, right? Well, Rabbi spoke about that in an article for the magazine Wine Spectator. He explained, "Before this discovery, we didn't know almost anything about this kind of industrial agriculture. And now we just know more and more." This Crusader winemaking facility was something like 3 times as big as the largest one ever discovered in the past. It's thought there was even a second floor at one point in time, which would have been quite impressive for the era. Evidence for this additional level, though, isn't entirely clear. Rabbi shared some thoughts about how this site actually operated. Having studied medieval documents, he knew that many people in the region had their own vineyards. What they lacked, however, were the necessary facilities to press their grapes into wine. So, what did these thirsty people do? Well, as Rabbi sees it, it's possible they brought the grapes from their own vineyards over to this facility in Melia. Then, in order to use the equipment set up there, they agreed to give the winery's owner a share of the resulting wine. The owner could store his grape juice in some sort of vat on the site, where it would ferment and become wine. The client, meanwhile, would take the pressed grape juice back home to ferment it. This theory definitely stands up, as evidence for winemaking in homes around the region has been discovered in the past. The discovery of this winery is really important, as it sheds light on how medieval Israel's society actually functioned. It tells us something about the economic realities, for one thing, but also the lived experience of normal people. It should go without saying that Rabbi was absolutely delighted by his discovery. In the Wine Spectator piece, Rabbi said, "The wine presses that I found were built in a very high quality, and their style is exceptional. So we know not only do we have a Frankish village, but that it was a very important Frankish village." Melia was probably the main wine producer in all the northern part of the kingdom. It seems the winery met its end when the Mamluks took over Melia around the middle of the 13th century. They had no need for the facility, so they simply built something else on top of it. The once thriving site remained hidden away for centuries, and maybe it would have been lost forever were it not for Salma's enthusiasm and Rabay's expertise. As part of a new business venture from Salma and her family, the site reopened, now with a full restaurant attached. Appropriately, the menu puts a great emphasis on wine. And best of all, visitors get to look down into the old facility. Maybe all the money the Asaf family invested into the excavations was worth it, then. After all, their new restaurant has a truly unique appeal. How many places can say they're built on top of an old winery from Crusader times? That's sure to convince both foodies and history buffs alike to come visit. And that's not the end of their vision, either. As Haaretz reported in August 2019, the Asafs laid out plans to open up a museum on the site as well. It looked like the winery would finally return to its former glory and more. But as for Rabay, he just wanted to keep on excavating to learn as much about his village as possible. It's safe to say that Rabay has his work cut out for him. Melia, after all, is sitting on centuries, millennia, even of history. Who knows what else he might find hidden away in his village? Given what he's found so far, you'd have to think there are plenty more interesting artifacts to stumble across. Melia residents have uncovered relics from the Crusades and the Byzantine era, but some of the other discoveries found in this area have been found to be far, far older than even that. The oldest discovery actually takes us back 10,000 years, but there's every reason to believe the area was inhabited before that. Anyone with an interest in human history should be grateful that Rabay took the initiative to begin investigating his village. Getting the money together to excavate at Melia wasn't necessarily easy, but he nonetheless persevered. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.